Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University. I'm also the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire. One of our projects is this series, Conversations with Organizers, in which we explore social change through discussion with activists and organizers. Today, my special guest is Dr. Tom Hastings on the topic of property destruction in nonviolent movements. Professor Hastings is professor and co-coordinator of conflict resolution at Portland State University. He's a board member of the Oregon Peace Institute and the director of Peace Voice, a nationwide media distribution network for peace scholarship and writing. His activism includes being a Plowshares activist and a founder of 2 Catholic worker houses. Professor Hastings is also the author of several books, including Nonviolent Responses to Terrorism, The Meek Ain't Weak, Nonviolent Power and People of Color, and A New Era of Nonviolence, The Power of Civil Society Over War. Thanks for being here, Professor Hastings.
Thank you, Jose.
I want to begin by talking with you a little bit about your dedication, your lifelong dedication as a nonviolent activist and scholar, and particularly all your work for many decades in Portland. What drew you to a life dedicated to nonviolent study and practice?
Well, I blame it on my sociology teacher in 11th grade. He brought us on a field trip to Chicago, to one of the largest, basically a ghetto, huge expanse of many African Americans all crammed into the south side of Chicago, and introduced us to a fellow who knew both Dr. King and Malcolm X. And I was only 16, it changed my whole sort of worldview. And I grew up in Minneapolis, and this field trip to Chicago prompted me to move to Chicago, to move in with that. It was called the Southside Christian Center. And I moved in there when I was 17, as soon as I graduated from high school. So that was sort of, got off to a running start in terms of like getting to know somebody who knew 2 of the germinal figures in the civil rights and justice movements. And then that was also, of course, during the Tet Offensive. So that was the most furious part of the Vietnam War. And a fellow who was way older than I was, about 20, talked me into going down and getting some draft counseling. I knew I was against this stupid war, but I was 17 and really didn't have any kind of sophisticated analysis of it. I just knew I didn't want to do it because it seemed really dumb. It wasn't like my dad's war. He was in World War II, and that, quote, made sense at that time. And yet the Vietnam War seemed really dumb. And the more I learned about it, the dumber it seemed. So I did go and get this draft counseling, and that really helped kind of shape my views. And I ultimately was successful in getting a conscientious objection status. And so that just sort of started me off, and I sort of never quit.
You've dedicated not only your academic life, though, to the study of nonviolence, but your activist life as well. And as I mentioned in the intro, you did a lot of activism through the Plowshares movement. Could you explain a little bit about what that was and what your involvement was with that?
Sure. I was actually not attracted to that kind of activism at first. Because it's sort of the small group, very dedicated, almost always very spiritually or faith-based, and I was much more attracted to the Dr. King sort of mass nonviolence model, and then a friend of mine, White Feather, a Native American friend, did a plowshare action, and I went to his trial. And he did it along with 2 priests and a lay Catholic lay person who had been very involved in the nonviolent resistance to nuclear weapons. So that trial radicalized me further, and it was in Kansas City, actually, at the federal courthouse, and they were sentenced. These 4 defendants were sentenced to 18, 18, 10, and 8 years. And my friend Whitefeather had never even been arrested for jaywalking, and they sentenced him to 8 years in prison for hammering on the absolutely symbolic hammering on the top of a 6-foot thick steel and concrete lid over a nuclear missile in Missouri. So this was, they were never going to hammer their way through a 6-foot thick steel reinforced concrete. So it was, they called it, plowshares, with a nod to the biblical verse, Isaiah 2, verse 4, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. And when the sentencing came in, it was so outrageous. They were sentenced to longer than rapists get sentenced for doing this symbolic damage, and they waited to get arrested. They didn't flee the scene. They didn't try to evade anything. They stood there until they were picked up. And so this was very open, very transparent, and it convinced me. I actually wrote a letter to the judge, and I said, I regret that I won't be in your courtroom, but you have now attempted to deter all of us from doing similar actions. I'd just like you to know, Judge, that this is having the opposite effect on me. I'm going to be going out and doing plowshare action now because this is just wrong. And so I went out and did one at a thermonuclear command center that was relatively close to where I lived. And so that was, property destruction at the, I guess I don't know about the highest level, but in terms of, being associated with activism, yeah, it was pretty much of an escalation. So I did that. Yeah, I did that twice, once in the 1980s, once in the 90s, and spent time in jails and prisons for that.
Yeah, so this is what I want to get to the heart of to talk with you about. Right, property destruction is a very controversial action amongst activists, and I think especially in the past 20 so years, ever since the 1999 World Trade Organization protests in Seattle, this has become a really heated discussion in different activist circles. The discussions that went on at the WTO around that encounter led some activists there to talk about the need for what's come to be known as a diversity of tactics for social movements. And so there's this phrase of diversity of tactics. How do you understand that concept and the call for the need for diversity of tactics in social movements?
Yeah, I've been on one particular side of that since that label was sort of emerged. And to me, it's really, I understand it from an emotional standpoint, but from a strategic standpoint, it is absolutely ineffective. Anytime you look at a social movement, it's not always completely cut and dried in terms of like trying to understand the empiricism of what's effective and what isn't. But by and large, when you have a violent flank, which is part of the diversity of tactics approach, you have a larger sort of peaceful movement, but then you have a violent flank to it. And sometimes that violent flank is interspersed, and sometimes it operates on the peripheries, or even at a different time. But if it's associated with that movement, what happens is the success of movements is directly related to numbers of people involved. It's not a one-one relationship, but it's pretty close relationship. So that with nonviolent social movements, you want to expand the numbers of people who are participating. So what happens when you have a diversity of tactics is that that is a barrier to recruitment, to participation. So the numbers go down. It will attract a small number of people who want to, you know, rock and roll, but it tends to alienate or at least dissuade larger numbers of people from getting involved. That is a death knell for whatever social movement we're talking about. So when we think in terms of like, how will this affect recruitment, that should be the filter through which all decisions are at least considered. If it will negatively affect recruitment, it's probably strategically not a good idea to do. If it will positively affect it, then it's probably a decent thing to aspire to or try.
So do you think that this idea of the diversity of tactics, this idea that that social movements should have a variety of different methods of engaging in direct action, which might include a quote unquote violent flank or one that's willing to engage in something like property destruction. Do you think that the idea of the diversity of tactics is not wise because of the way in which violence is perceived in the United States? I'm thinking about the question. The reason I ask this question is because one of my friends is Mark Rudd, who you probably well know, right? Who was one of the Weatherman faction of the Students for Democratic Society, who was involved in the bombings in the 1970 against U.S. government facilities. And he went underground for many years to try to escape federal prosecution for involvement in that form of domestic terrorism. And but eventually, when he came out, he rejected all of the methods of the Weather Underground because he felt that it was, as you were pointing out, not strategic, not prudent for social change, because he believes that in the United States, violence, the public sees violence in a certain way. Either you have to be insane to engage in violence, or you're a criminal, right? This is the perception of people who engage in it by the wider public. So that when you do engage in violence, for most people, right, you're either a criminal or you're insane, and people don't want to associate with that. And so in his view, it's unwise to use violence as a tactic of direct action, because for most people put you into one of those two categories. Do you agree with that sort of analysis about how the American public understands violence in our society?
Yes, I do. And it was interesting to me when Rudd actually sort of publicly apologized for all of his actions that were associated with violence. So there's a number of considerations. First of all, the idea that doing something to property is violent is not universally accepted, of course, that property is property and people are people. So we need to differentiate between those two. That's important. But then it gets pretty granular in how people accept or don't accept the idea of destroying some property. And in fact, in the Plowshare movement, what we attempt to do, number one, we're very transparent. We don't run, we don't try to hide from prosecution. We own all of our actions. We're very accountable, but also in some states, there's actually a defense against that, because what happens, it was explained to me by one of our lawyers back in the day. He said, imagine, and then he held up a pen. So imagine that this highlighter is my highlighter. I bought it, I paid for it, it's my property. It is legally mine. And then you, Dr. Orosco, as a reasonable person, see that I'm in an argument with somebody else. They're a little bit off camera right now, but that argument is getting more and more heated. And then you see me pick up this highlighter and you see me grab it in a way that indicates to you, a reasonable person, that I might be about to harm somebody. And you reach out and you grab this and it breaks. So the question legally is, have you destroyed my property? And that depends on what state you're in. Some states have laws that say, no, the minute you, a reasonable person, could tell that it was about to be used in the commission of a crime, it ceased being my property and it became a form of contraband or criminal instrumentalia. And then it is no longer legally defined. It is still a material object, but it's not property anymore. So this is the granular difference that we in the Plowshare movement have always felt about going out to hammer on a nuclear weapon, well, not directly on the weapon, but on a component, a guidance component of it, a command center that tells it to launch, maybe a nose cone in a factory that's destined. So all of this, as we understand it, is not harming anybody's private property, and not even property. We regard it as criminal, frankly. Nuclear weapons, by definition, our definition, and one we're willing to take to the public and put to the court of public opinion and put into the court legally and say, let's talk about this. And so what we believe is that we have not committed property destruction, we have prevented a crime instead. That's something that takes a lot of explanation.
Yeah.
Repeated explanation. So when I was in jail awaiting trial for 4 months, I wrote a letter to the editor or an essay every single day as part of my jail discipline. And my friend Mike Miles got me, all these addresses of all these newspapers. And I had commissary money, so I bought stamps and envelopes. So I was sending all this out, literally explaining myself to my neighbors, to my fellow citizens in my state, literally daily. And this is what we have to do if we're going to do something like property destruction, quote unquote. If we don't do that, it will be negatively received. And if we go and harm somebody's private property, that's pretty much always going to be seen as a threat. People don't like it when, I don't know if Americans are more nervous about private property than anybody else anywhere else, but I know that in our culture, they do not like it when you hurt somebody's private property. So it needs to be sort of relentlessly explained.
Yeah, so you've actually written an article about this where you in fact argue that property destruction can be part of a nonviolent campaign for social change, but under some certain strict conditions. And so I'm going to share here for our viewers, at least, the conditions that you've laid out for property destruction and nonviolent direct action. And I'll read these so that people can hear. But you say that property destruction and nonviolent direct action is acceptable strategically and morally, I assume too, because as long as the following hold, right, that no private individual's property is being destroyed, the item destroyed was harming others, the core organizers of the campaign approved of the physical action of destruction ahead of time, no property destruction happens in the context of a public event unless the destruction was advertised ahead of time as likely to occur, and the destruction can be explained very well and repeatedly to the public by those who are totally transparent in the actions and then are demonstrably committed to nonviolent strategy otherwise. So you say that if an action can meet these conditions, then property destruction is acceptable as part of a nonviolent campaign. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this. You've explained a little bit about this idea of that property destruction can be done if it's if the people who are engaging in it are being transparent and they're willing to be arrested and imprisoned for it. But there's some interesting things here that I wanted to ask you about here. So on the one hand, you say that no private individual's property can be destroyed. So presumably, like when you were engaged in the Plowshares actions, you were symbolically trying to do harm to government property.
Right.
And so here, I guess this would be different. No private individual's property is destroyed. So this would be different than, say, firebombing a car. That would not be acceptable, right?
Right.
What
Yeah.
about though throwing a brick through a Starbucks window? This is something that occurred in some of the instances in Seattle in 1999 at the WTO. Would that be an acceptable form of property destruction, symbolic property destruction?
No, by my lights. And of course, this is all like just out of my own experience. This
Sure.
is not, I'm not the person in charge of everybody's belief system, but by my lights, and I've thought about this, for a lot of decades now, how does somebody know, for one thing, if anybody's on the inside of that Starbucks? When they throw a brick through the window, is that going to produce flying shards of glass that's going to hurt somebody? But number two, was this advertised ahead of time? Do people come to WTO, for example, with the understanding property destruction is going to happen? So if I go there, I may be associated with this. And so those are the conditions under which I am willing to participate. If that's not announced ahead of time, that's really unfair to people who show up. I mean, I remember right during WTO having these conversations with people. Oh yeah, this is legitimate thing to do. These are evil corporations. And what I noted was that the people who were doing this oftentimes were attempting to evade arrest. So you have this, sort of confluence of problems here. You have people doing these things, even though that was not part of the plan originally. So you're sweeping in everybody else with this. Then you have people running away after they do this if they see law enforcement. So my challenge was to them was also like, you're gonna charge out of here because you're young, you're fast, and so these little old Quaker ladies who are sitting there with their signs, they're the ones who are going to get clobbered by law enforcement. You're happy with that? That seems kind of cowardly to me. So there's just a number of sort of negative aspects of this. But then also you look at the dynamic that happened after WTO. When you look at what happened later on in Montreal, all the way to eventually to Italy, where by that time law enforcement they came out of the gate charging and in fact killed a kid.
Right.
And this is the dynamic that gets set up. When the police are geared up by that kind of destruction, then we see what happens. And now we're seeing it right now in cities, and certainly in my town in Portland, and we just saw it in Kenosha, even worse.
Yeah, so this, I mean, just to give some kinds of granular examples, what would, if someone was looking at this and said, well, we decided to firebomb a police vehicle in Minneapolis. It's not a private individual's property, and we consider the police to be harming a harming force in our community. Would firebombing a police vehicle be acceptable according to these conditions?
Well, if it's done in complete isolation from, I mean, it would never qualify in my book as a nonviolent act, because explosions and fire are things that you can't control. Once you start it, it's out of your control. To me, if you have not really bounded that action strictly within your control, how can you make sure that it remains nonviolent? It's kind of impossible. So this is the problem with arson of any type. It's a problem with explosions, and firebombing is kind of a combination of the two. But beyond that, if it's done in the context of a mass movement that has not said, this is a violent uprising. We are an insurgency now, and we will arm ourselves. This is civil war, basically. Once you say that, yeah, then all bets are off. But it's certainly can't fall under the penumbra of nonviolence.
Yeah, I mean, even in violent conflict, right? There are restrictions about what you can do according to international law that follow just war. So, right, you can't target civilians, and there's questions about proportionality. So, violence is recognized as, in some cases, even when violence is recognized as necessary for armed insurgency, there are still limits there, right? What's interesting to me is that what I see built into some of your conditions here, this is sort of a kind of a Gandhian notion of nonviolent action, in the sense that you are trying to let people know ahead of time the kind of action that you're going to engage in. You're trying to be transparent and letting people prepare for the kind of coercion or the kind of property destruction that may happen. But you're essentially saying that unless that sort of transparency is there, and that kind of accountability is there ahead of time, then it's not likely to be a form of nonviolent action that's going, or a form of direct action that's going to be effective, because it will be seen as unnecessarily violent.
Yes, and to me, it's all about recruitment again. That then you have to think about, so what are the barriers to recruitment, and what are the attractions or incentives to recruitment? And so looking at the barriers, they would include potential loss of jobs, physical harm, the things that one would risk by engaging in violence are much greater than engaging in nonviolence. And this is not well understood in some ways. In an intuitive sense, it's not well understood from the standpoint of those who have done nonviolent action one time and have been clubbed on the head, so that they perceive nonviolence to be more risky. But what happens is, when you study movements, you see that it's pretty normal for a movement to be tested. I mean, I just call it the test. Is that the first time you go out, you may get bonked. And then if you maintain nonviolent discipline, the chances that you're going to be hurt again are diminished. So when the movement is seen as increasingly nonviolent, then the risks actually go down, because the armed agents of the state actually begin to trust that you mean it when you say that you're nonviolent. Right now, there's no trust. And after WTO, the trust was diminished. So that the idea is to build up that trust, so that police, or whoever the armed agents of the state are, they're not operating out of fear. Because most of the time their violence is based on, and it's actually justified in court by them as, we were in fear for whatever. So reducing the fear is a way to reduce the harm. Reducing the risks and of that harm is a way to invite more people to participate, and it's a successful strategy.
Right, and I think that this is actually something, I think that this is a strategy that, or a principle that Gandhi built into his work, right? The idea that he believed that if a person witnesses suffering taking place, this affects them by piercing their heart in some sense. So he believed that appealing to that sympathy or empathy for suffering was a stronger kind of motivating force for people to become involved in a nonviolent movement than simply giving them arguments about why they should be more just or more fair or to think critically about society. But if you showed people suffering, they were more likely to want to come to your side. So what you're saying is that if you're going to engage in property destruction, do so in a way that doesn't create more fear in society that then justifies the violence of the state, but then also brings in third-party people to your side of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, when I got out of prison, it was very interesting because this old farm couple drove up. I was living in the country in northern Wisconsin. They drove up into my driveway, and it was like, I mean, I knew them. They were just a pair of rural folks, pretty redneck, frankly. And they didn't even get out of the car. They just rolled down the window. And the wife said to me, "I just want you to know that I'm not mad at you." And so it was like this, it was this willingness to suffer. You know, I got a 3-year prison sentence out of that. All we had to do was walk away. We did this in the middle of the Chequamegon National Forest. There would have been no way for them to, quote, catch us. We wanted to bring this into the court of public opinion. We wanted to do it in an accountable fashion. And I mean, we had 2 charges against us. One was the very serious charge, which had a 10-year sentence to it. That was sabotage. The other was much more minor. It was destruction of property, which was interesting because we were in a state where that defense, that legal defense I described to you earlier, was not available to us. So the jury actually had no choice at all but to convict us of property destruction because we stipulated to that. Yes, we did this, and here's why we did this. And we had some really good witnesses on our behalf, including the skipper of a nuclear submarine, or former skipper, including an international law expert, including the design team leader whose design for warheads is still the one that's on Trident nuclear submarines. All of them testified on our behalf, saying that actually these 2 people did nothing that interfered with the defense of the United States of America. They did interfere with our ability to start a preemptive nuclear attack, so that the jury was informed about this. The jury deliberated and acquitted us of sabotage. So this was, it was interesting from the standpoint of all of the public education that had happened in the years and then in the 4 months of just, you know, every single day, letting people know why we did this. And then and I just called it contaminating the jury pool. I mean, then by the time the jury was selected, they were much more prepared to at least listen to us. And then when you bring up a former you know, commander of a nuclear submarine who says he was actually earning a master's degree in international relations while he was driving a submarine around.
Wow.
And he said, I realized at one point that every single day I was out to sea in this nuclear submarine, I was in violation of international law. He said that out loud to the jury. So, I mean, you have this, you know, very different situation than just smash and dash that we see now, which it's just, as you say, very strategically unwise. And, you know, Gandhi had a strong philosophy about that willingness to suffer. That was equal parts philosophy and strategy, I think. He was a brilliant strategist. He was also, you know, very convinced of his philosophy. So in his case and in the case of Dr. King, I regard those as equal parts, strategy and philosophy.
Well, let's talk about Dr. King for a second. So, you know, obviously we're talking right now at a time in which this is a grand moment in some sense for social movements in the United States. Right? Some people have been saying that the protests that have erupted after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, These have been some of the most numerous and largest protests in US history, some people are saying. And there have been a lot of criticisms about some of the property destruction that took place in Minneapolis, and now we're seeing things that have gone on in Portland and now in Kenosha and other places across the country having to do with reactions to police violence. You know, toward the end of his life, Dr. King was asked whether he would condemn people who engaged in riots in the US during these protests against racial and economic injustice. And his response to this was in, I think, in March of 1968, in the speech, the Other America speech, he said that he considered it to be morally inappropriate for him to condemn the people who rioted without considering the larger context of social and economic injustice that led people to feel that rioting was the only means they had to express themselves. So this is the famous speech in which he said that the riot is the language of the unheard. Would you agree with his analysis that to condemn rioters as criminals and thugs without looking at the bigger sort of picture, which is something that our political leaders have done, right, including President Obama, President Trump. Would you agree that there's something problematic about staying at that level of condemnation without thinking about the deeper social, political, economic issues that are leading people to feel so constrained?
I would agree with Dr. King, and of course he went on to contextualize this a pretty fair bit, just as Gandhi contextualized his so-called doctrine of the sword, whereby, I guess the way that I sort of talk about it is this, that if you look at the just war doctrine to which you referred a little while ago, these riots are absolutely justified. But justifying war or justifying violence is not the same thing as saying that that's effective. So once again, we're looking at like what works versus what is justifiable. And the other sort of aspect of this that I'm really clear with my fellow activists who are all about a diversity of tactics is this. And this actually works. Arguing with them about morals or strategy is useless, in my experience. What finally worked as an organizer for me is what I call my mismovement manners talk. And that is to say, look, we need mutual respect here. When we are doing our events, we are calling them family friendly, we're calling them nonviolent. You're welcome to participate if you use and abide by our code of conduct about which we are really explicit. And if you do your thing, your diversity of tactics across town or on a different day, not part of ours, we will not condemn you. And that goes directly with Dr. King. However, and this is, you know, I did this like kind of in the middle of a lot of very diversity of tactics friendly folks at a place that used to exist here in Portland called Liberty Hall. It was kind of ground zero for those folks. They would be called Antifa now. They used to call themselves Black Bloc, anarchists, whatever. But they were all about diversity of tactics. And I would say to them, and did say to them, if you do that in the context of our demonstration that we've called on a day that we've just arbitrarily said, this is the day we're going to do this, this is the place we're going to do this, this is our code. If you come in and violate our code, we will condemn you then. And we will approach you, we will condemn you to the media who are on hand, we will condemn you to law enforcement who are on hand, we will condemn you unequivocally. We don't want to do that. We want you to respect our organizing because we're meeting every week to organize these things. We don't see you at the table with us. This is an organizing effort that takes a lot of work. Have some respect and we'll respect your organizing. You do an event, we're not going to condemn you. We will respect your organizing, but we need to keep things separate. And that that level of mutual respect can be gained, but it has to be done through what Dorothy Day would call gentle personalism. It's all about relationships. So this was like my experience with them, where I was a core organizer, was like 2002, 2003, when we were trying to stop the invasion of Iraq. And so when we were able to get that mutual respect, that removed the biggest barrier to participation. And all of a sudden we had, every time we would call a demonstration, we broke the state record. It just kept growing. And that's because the fear was reduced. Law enforcement basically was further and further away from us. By the time it was done, my friend Michael Corrigan from Eugene and I had trained in 90 peacekeepers. We took care of our own security. And we did this outreach to the Black Bloc, and we had mutual courtesy going on. They did not act out during our demonstrations. That meant the next time that we had a demonstration, even more people would show up, so that, you know, we were able to actually grow a movement. And it is my contention, I mean, there's no way to prove it, but I had the feeling like, geez, if this is the kind of organizing that was happening nationwide, we might have been able to stop that invasion, because we had at one point we had about 40,000 people at the final demonstration against this before the invasion. That was in a town of, at that time, about 400,000 in Portland. So that's about 10% of the population. And if you look at the research done by Chenoweth and Stefan, again and again, in their 323 cases that they studied, once you reach 3.5% of the population that's involved on a sustained basis, you won't lose. You are going to win. And you know, that number can be challenged someday if that number is achieved and a campaign doesn't win. But between 1900 and 2006, and all of the cases they studied, that has held true. So we achieved significantly more than that in Portland. What if that model of organizing had happened? It made me a complete believer in peace teams, in organizing our own security from within our own movement.
I mean, I take it that that's if you read the manifestos on diversity of tactics, that would be the ideal, right? Is that you mutually agree to have different actions with different tactics involved, and you don't condemn each other unless you, in some sense, intervene in each other's work. So it sounds like you were engaging in diversity of tactics with the work that you were doing, but you were holding to nonviolent strategy within your own actions.
Well, we weren't promoting anything that they were doing that was so-called diversity of tactics, and we did not allow ourselves to be associated with that. So I didn't perceive myself. I mean, you raised, that's very interesting, that could be a perception. What to me it was different than that, but now you make me think about that.
I'm just thinking about folks like Peter Gelderloos and folks who are critics of nonviolent strategy and proponents of diversity of tactics. And one of their big arguments is that one of the things that Gelderloos often says is, I'm just saying we want to be able to have space to be able to engage in property destruction without being condemned by the peaceniks. That's all we want to be able to do. And it seems at least that that's what you were doing in Portland around the war, even though perhaps you didn't associate yourself with someone like Gelderloos or with that sort of view, but you were essentially letting people do that if they so wanted to, as long as they didn't somehow infringe on the work that you were doing, which had a very transparent and open commitment to nonviolent strategy.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because my challenge to the Black Bloc then was we don't even have an upper limit yet on what we can organize. We don't even know what that is. But I think your upper limit is about 300. And my challenge to them was, let's see what you can do. You know, we won't interfere. And that was about the upper limit. They could raise between 200 or 300 people. That background rate is still pretty much the case. I mean, you look at what's happening in Portland now, and the big masses of people are there and have been there like up until maybe 10, maybe 11 at night at the latest. And then the numbers go way down, and all of the, you know, I guess the violence, you know, I do want to contextualize this a little bit because I think that there's a real misunderstanding about the levels of violence involved. If you look at the violence of...
You mean the violence at the Justice Center in Portland?
Yes, and this is historically the case too with Antifa, or before them the Black Bloc. The idea of the bomb-throwing anarchist is something that goes back, you know, well over 100 years, and that's really now what we're seeing now. Antifa or any of the antecedents have not been shooting people. They haven't been doing what law enforcement's been doing. They've been doing some things that I regard as really, really counterproductive. And that would include things like shining these big green lasers at cops, or shooting fireworks at them, or throwing stones at them. That's really counterproductive, and it basically starts after the crowd is reduced substantially. Most of the peace people are gone by then, so that again and again we see that the people willing to engage in this sort of counterproductive activity are really pretty small numbers. They get, they get an outsized amount of publicity, but they're really pretty small numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to get without having actually for folks to be in Portland to see what's going on. The national media has portrayed this in wildly different kinds of ways about what's going on in Portland, that the whole city is burning down or something or other. But as you point out, you know, now we're facing more than 90 days of continuous protests since the killing of George Floyd in Portland. And a lot of this was exacerbated by the deployment of federal troops to the Justice Center by President Trump. And that's when you started to see large numbers of people coming during the day. There was the wall of moms and the wall of dads, and just, you know, thousands of people coming during the day to protest the deployment of the federal troops there. And from, you know, if you watch the live streams, what you see, as you pointed out, is that there would be lots of crowds there, and then about after 11 p.m., those big crowds would dissipate, and then there would be a few hundred or so, maybe 200 people around the Justice Center who would then hang out. And that's when the time when you started to see small garbage fires and lasers, and that's when they would come out and start to deploy the tear gas and the non-lethal munitions against the crowd. So it was a really sort of different scene than what the national media portrayed, which was sort of a constant kind of attack on federal property. Given your theory of property destruction, in which you say that some property destruction can be allowable, did you see anything at the Justice Center that you would think made strategic sense, or did you think that it was simply just taunting the police to come out and be violent?
Yeah, I mean, the latter, really kind of like engaging in a lot of cathartic activity that maybe emotionally was satisfying to that small group of people. but very alienating to the general public. I mean, and like you say, this is, I mean, I wrote another piece that I titled Window Breakers for Trump. I mean, this is being used incessantly by the Trump campaign now to talk about how he's, and we saw it last night in the Republican National Convention, that, oh, well, we're the law and order people, Portland's on fire, Seattle's on fire, these, you know, these terrible people have made these cities uninhabitable. I'm sorry, but you know, there are some boarded up places, mostly in downtown. There's one boarded up building in North Portland. That's the police union headquarters, and everything else in town just goes on. By far, the largest impact on this city is COVID-19, not the rioting that is being misportrayed by Fox News and by the Trump campaign as somehow widespread. It's not widespread at all.
One last thing I'd like to sort of touch upon, though, is one reaction that many people have had to these kinds of discussions, though, is to say, well, look, white people or people who are not part of any kind of community in Minneapolis or Portland or Kenosha, the argument would be, you just don't have a right to criticize how Black people will respond to police violence. How would you react to that sentiment?
Well, I've got a couple personal reactions, which is that my sons are mixed race, African American, and I'm going to defend them, and I see nonviolence as being their best defense by far. When we talk about Black people and everybody else, that's kind of ignoring the fact that a lot of us are from racially mixed families that give us kind of different points of view. That's one thing. Number two, though, is, yeah, I don't presume to tell anybody how to liberate themselves. And I have not been the one to say, well, you know, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, with regard to what's been going on in the name of Black Lives Matter. I will note that those of us on the Portland Peace Team who have been invited by Black Lives Matter to come out and provide nonviolent security have been very happy to do so. And most of the time, they are events during the day at various places around the town. It could be in a park, it could be, well, there have been a couple of walks through various neighborhoods, and we're very happy to go out and do this. And these are events that have been proclaimed as nonviolent and family friendly. So that's where we, you know, and we're a racially diverse group of peacekeepers. So we're very happy to participate in that. And our advice ahead of time to the organizers, if they're interested, is, and we never go out unless we're invited, is you should ask the police to stay away. We'll take care of our security ourselves within the context of your event. We generally do that much more effectively than the police do because we don't provoke people. The police show up and, well, okay, as an example, every single time that we've gone out and we've been met by a combination of the group that invited us and the alt-right, the Patriot Prayer or Proud Boys or whatever, we do a much better job of de-escalating that than if the police show up. Because when the police show up, then all of a sudden that tends to provoke Antifa, and then they do stuff that provokes the alt-right, and pretty soon we see what happens. When the nonviolent peace force, or I'm sorry, the peacekeepers are there, the peace team, then we're able to de-escalate people because the police have not provoked them in the first place. So all we get is like one or two people who start ranting, and we can manage that. So it's
I think that there have been some studies that have shown that when you look at violence in social movements, that a lot of eruptions of violence are due to the presence of police officers in the midst of all of the action, right? So that makes sense. This makes me, think about this question for you. Do you think that a commitment to nonviolence and the kind of life that you've led for many, many decades, do you think that a commitment to nonviolence means also a commitment to either de-arming, disbanding, or abolishing police forces in the United States?
I do, but I mean, this has got to be predicated, to me, it's just kind of buck naked obvious that we have to repeal the Second Amendment. As long as we have the Second Amendment, we will see what we see. Proliferation of hundreds of millions of guns. And then, like we saw this murder, a double murder in Kenosha, and the third victim lost his arm, for God's sakes. And because as long as we have the Second Amendment, then you're going to have Americans arming themselves, and the police are not going to be the ones to disarm. So that to me is the root of all of our problems, is that Second Amendment. There's no other country on earth that has that sort of enshrined in their constitution. So this is a fundamental problem. When I bring it up, people say, "Oh, that's not doable." Well, then neither is the kind of police reform that we need. Yes, we can tinker with it. Absolutely, we should change the way that 911 operates. If a call comes in and there's no weapons on the scene, if you can determine this, the dispatcher who fields a call should find out if there are any weapons visible, anything like that. That should be one thing. The other thing is there a felony being committed right now? Now, if you've got either one of those, then the police are going to go and they're going to be armed. That's kind of, that's the way that it's going to be. But that dispatch system, or that response system, I think, is in need of a serious overhaul. It's being tried, as you know, here and there, sending out different personnel who are not armed to manage some 911 calls, especially calls that are about, "Oh, I just don't want this person around me. They're homeless, they're dirty." Okay, don't send an armed agent of the state to manage your discomfort. This has led to tragedy. So or if it's clearly a mental health issue where there's no weaponry involved, never send an armed agent, because they're not trained to respond to somebody. I mean, we saw that in Portland with 2 or 3 different times. It's just tragic. I mean, people going through their own struggles with mental health or addiction, and an armed agent of the state shows up, and the next thing is somebody's dead. Nobody had to die there. That person could have been calmed down, could have been managed by somebody who is professionally trained to do that.
And, just to add, your home institution, Portland State University, has just learned about this and disarmed its public safety officers after the tragic circumstances in which an African-American man was in fact shot in the midst of a confrontation with those officers, right? And so
Yeah.
there are these attempts, and it seems that Portland State is leading away and at least reassessing whether or not it needs to respond to all calls with armed officers.
Exactly. I mean, from the time Portland State began until just 6 years ago, all the security agents on campus were unarmed. There was never a shooting. Nobody was ever killed. The system was working just fine. It wasn't broken. It didn't need to be fixed. And then, as you rightly say, and I testified as a faculty member, I testified 3 times to the Board of Trustees. Don't do this. This is what will happen. That's what happened. An African-American guy was killed completely needlessly and tragically. So now we're going back to you know, the way that it was when I started teaching there and for decades before that. And it
Yeah.
always worked.
Yeah, there's a struggle going on. This is something that's going on in my home university right now, Oregon State, where we're establishing a new police force, and the insistence is that it be armed. So this controversy has risen for us in a really poignant way, right? So this will be a struggle that we go on, and it's something going on across the country in really dramatic ways. But I want to thank you very much for your time, Tom. Learned a lot, and we appreciate your helping us to sort of sort through many of these different kinds of issues. Thank you for your perspective and time today.
Well, thank you too for this opportunity, and for you make me sharpen my pencil, so I appreciate that.
And thank you all for tuning in and coming to see us or to listen to us. If you have thoughts and comments, please leave us a comment down below and let us know what you think. You can also reach us on social media. We are available on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Anarres Project. Our Facebook, our website is anarresproject.org. And you can also find us on SoundCloud if you would prefer to have just an audio of our discussions. Thank you very much for listening in and tuning in, and we hope to hear from you. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Jose.